Okay, so we're talking about change, and I'm talking about embracing change without complaint. This is a very specific type of change we're going to be discussing, organizational change. This information, of course, is going to help if you suddenly find yourself unemployed, for sure. And yes, this will be useful if you have changes in your personal relationships at home or your physical well-being. You experience a sudden change in that. But overall, I'm framing this conversation this morning as it pertains to our career, and nothing affects our career like organizational change. So let me define it really briefly. It's an event or a program that a business initiates which causes significant disruption to daily activities. Now, if they put in a big, new, wonderful cafeteria in your office, that's not going to necessarily disrupt things per se, daily operations. So these are changes organizationally that we might look at as a negative change. Okay. If you did research on your own of all the different types of organizational change, you're going to find websites where they say there are 2 main types of change and 12 types of changes, 6 types of changes. So it varies. This is not my scientific assessment of all the different types of organizational change. This is what I have boiled down to, I believe, the 4 main types: strategic transformational change, people-centric change, structural change, and remedial change. We don't have the time to dive into all the different aspects of all of these. That's really not what I'm going to be talking about. You can do the research on your own. I'm going to be going at it from a different perspective, from a mindset, how we can embrace the change. But I do want to briefly, ever so quickly, define each of these, okay? So you don't have to necessarily take notes on this. This will just kind of give us a jumping off point. Strategic transformational change is company-wide. It's when there's changes, for example, to the main mission of the company. It's when an enterprise-wide new technology is introduced where everybody has to use it, like they decide to take everybody to the entire company to a Salesforce platform or a new massive learning and development system. That's strategic and transformational company-wide. Then there's what we refer to as people-centric change, which some examples are if all of the executive leaders are summarily dismissed, that's a massive people-centric change. But this could even apply to you getting a new boss, or your boss getting a new boss, or them implementing a new family leave policy. Maybe restricting it when all of our benefits changed a decade ago. That's a people-centric change. When they decide to change the roles and responsibilities or other policies that are people-focused, that's disruptive. Structural changes involve shifts in management hierarchy. This is different than people-centric because I'm referring to things like mergers and acquisitions, creating all new departments that didn't used to be there, or breaking off a group of people and putting them on their own, taking legacy products and shoving those down one group's throat, and then this other group gets all the new exciting technology, so their departmental roles change. Sometimes it can be when an entire team, the sales team, instead of reporting to the CFO anymore, they switch that completely over to the chief operating officer. I've been in companies where that's happened. And then lastly, there's remedial change. Remedial change is when it's reactionary. It tends to be done quickly, kind of off the cuff, like responding to bad press, or like all of us went through with COVID, when suddenly everyone has to work from home. It has to happen super quick. It's remedial. Dealing with the fallout of your largest client, the person, let's say, who's developed the entire technology that your product is based on, that person leaves and starts her own business. These are remedial changes that you have to respond to very quickly. There is kind of a famous change management platform known as the Kubler-Ross change curve. As you look at this, you'll notice it looks a lot like the stages of grief. It's very similar, but it's based on a lot of change management science, where you start at denial when the change when the big change first comes or is first announced. Then you get angry, then you get depressed. Then you start to experiment with the changes, kind of slowly taking them on. Then you make a decision, am I going to stay or go? And then you accept it and start kind of thriving again. Where the axes are energy level, which, you know, I'm famously constantly talking about over time, okay? The key here is to go through this process as fast as possible, or to get to a place where we're sophisticated enough to kind of hop over some of these stages, because they don't always have to happen. It's really a matter of our mindset, okay? This is the organizational change framework that I'm now going to introduce, this idea of new wine or the old wine. I'm emphasizing the wine, okay? This is the wine and the garment parable. It's the parable that Jesus told that can be found in all three synoptic gospels, but 3 of the 4 gospels. And even though it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we're going to be focusing very specifically on where it's found in Luke, because the context and the layout, I think, are brilliant. I won't show you, but if anybody's interested in seeing how I kind of break down the analysis of the same parable in 3 gospels, I'm willing to show that. I have some notes, but let's just look at together. I'll read it out loud, the Luke 5 version of what I think it's fairly commonly referred to as the double parable of the wine and the garment, okay? No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Otherwise, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins and it will be spilled out, and the skins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into fresh wine skins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wishes for the new, for he says, the old is good enough. Okay, we're going to dissect this, because I think it's really important to grasp this deeply. I'm going to ask a rhetorical question just so I can, present this in only 20 minutes. I'll try for that. Ultimately, we want to ask, what exactly is that parable about? Obviously, when we read a parable, that's kind of the natural thing that we do. What is Jesus trying to convey here? No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and puts it on an old. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. New wine must be put into new wineskins. Most people over the years, certainly me, and most people that I've ever spoken to about this, would say that Jesus is comparing the Old Testament, the old teaching of the Torah, Old Testament law, to this new teaching of the gospel, which is New Testament grace. That the old garment, old wine, new garment, new wine is Old Testament law versus New Testament grace. Well, I hope you come to expect this from me. I want to propose a completely different way of looking at this. In my research of this parable, which if you guys want to see it, I can kind of show you this. I'll try to support where I arrived at this, but there's other stuff I just can't get into unless you say, Shawn, I really have to see this other stuff. I'll share it with you. But in my research, I found that there's something profound that I've overlooked for decades as a Christian when I'm trying to understand this. It's not that he's comparing Old Testament law with New Testament grace. He was instead referring very specifically to students. The old and the new garment, the old and the new wineskin, is referring to trained, that's the old, versus untrained, that's the new, students. Us, me and you. In the context of his time, he's contrasting the Pharisees, the old garment, the old wineskin, not the old law, the old way of doing things, but the people, their mindset, with the new, the disciples, the new garment, the new wineskins. Basically, he's contrasting the know-it-all mindset of the Pharisees, which I think we can ascribe some arrogance to, elitism, snobbery, if you will, greed perhaps, to the learning, humble mindset of the disciples. Now, good news is I'm not going to ask you to just swallow this. I'm going to demonstrate why I believe this. And context, of course, matters. I want to explain how this can be looking at what was occurring, before, during, and after Jesus told this specific parable. And here's a very simple chart to illustrate this. This is the context of the parable. It ranges from the first verse in Luke chapter 5 all the way down to the 16th verse of Luke chapter 6. Here, the highlighted portion is that double parable, the wine and the wineskin and the cloth, the garment and the wine. But at Luke 5, 1 through 11, interestingly, it starts with the choosing of his first disciples. That is how this segment of Jesus's story starts. We then see two very brief healing stories, the leper and the paralytic. And then at verse 27, we see the calling of Levi as a disciple, which we know it becomes renamed to Matthew. Because Levi is so affected by this, he holds this giant banquet. So we then see down in verse 29 through 35, the Pharisees arrive at the banquet and they start criticizing the disciples for quote unquote eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners. Then we see Jesus uses the double parable, the old and new garment and wine, which is how chapter 5 basically ends. Then we get into the first 5 verses of chapter 6, where the Pharisees start accusing the disciples of violating the Sabbath. They attack the way the disciples are behaving once again. You guys aren't following the Old Testament law. You guys aren't doing it the way that we used to do it. So Jesus responds to them with a similar Sabbath story. And then we see that the end of this little segment of verses, Jesus chooses and calls by name the 12 who would become the 12 apostles. So if you look at this very quickly, you see disciples, disciple, disciples, 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 Pharisees, Pharisees. It's around the context of the followers of Jesus and how the Pharisees were viewing them. They were criticizing Jesus for choosing these unschooled people, let's say, at least unschooled completely in the Jewish tradition, the Jewish law. It's as if the Pharisees are saying, you made a strategic transformation organizationally. You went this new organizational change path and you left us out of it. What's wrong with us? Why didn't you choose people who are already trained, who know the law, who have a grasp of the teachings of the Torah, who've devoted their lives to the public service of the tabernacle? Why haven't you chosen us? And they're criticizing how the disciples are behaving because they don't fit into the original organizational structure. So Jesus is introducing a profound organizational change. A piece of cloth from a new garment to mend an old garment. New wine can't go into old wineskins. New wine has to be put in the new wineskins. Here's the symbolism. The new and the old garments, as well as the new and the old wineskins, are the students, those that are not yet trained and those that are previously trained. The patch of new cloth and the new and old wine represent the teaching. No one takes a lesson that's meant for a new student, those that are not yet fully trained, and tries to teach it to an old, already trained student. If we do that, we'll not only not be training the new because we're focused on the old are going to reject it anyways. It's going to disrupt what they're doing. No one teaches new teaching to old, previously trained students. If he does, the new teaching will be rejected. The student will be lost. Instead, new teaching must be taught to new students, and no one after receiving an old teaching, no one who's previously trained, wants new teaching because they say the old is better. So does this mean Jesus is basically saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Just real quick, if you could put in a chat window and answer that question, because we don't have time to talk about it. In the chat window, what do you think? Is Jesus saying you can't teach old dogs new tricks? Yes or no? And no maybes allowed. Yeah, for some reason I can't see the chat. I've got something mixed up, but I'll look at it afterwards. There's probably a lot of no's, probably a lot of yeses. Well, let me give you the answer. The answer is no. What is it saying?
What is it saying?
If you aren't willing to be taught, then what you are taught will be lost on you. The opportunity for people who are ready to be taught will also be lost because I'm spending time trying to teach you. Jesus is not saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks. He's saying your mindset must be ready to accept the change. We know this because Jesus did choose an old dog. He chose Paul. Paul was able to embrace the new. Paul, the soon-to-be apostle. Jesus appeared to him at a blinding light on the road to Damascus. It took some blindness to get him there, but he transformed. He accepted the change in a very short period of time, 3 days. I believe this is also what Jesus meant in Matthew 18, 1-4. I won't read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the blue here. Unless you change and become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless we change our mindset, unless we become learners like little children, we will miss the way. So let's compare the Pharisees to the disciples. How did the Pharisees, by and large, I know there were some great exceptions to this, amen, but by and large, how did the Pharisees overall deal with the organizational change that was happening? They complained about it, they challenged it, they tried to prevent it by violently opposing it, and they attacked the change agent. Instead of looking at the merits of what he was saying, all they saw was change, don't like it. New organizational philosophy, not going to embrace it. Forget it. We're going to stop this. Compare that to how the disciples dealt with this change. They supported it. They embraced it. They chose to learn from it. And by learning, ask lots and lots of questions. They weren't flawless. Of course, we know they made lots of mistakes, but they were willing to listen to the change agent. So the question I want us to ask, and we can discuss this in the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes or so, is if we look at this willingness to accept organizational change that's happening in your company right now, for whatever the reasons are, whatever those 4 types of changes are, if we look at that as a continuum with the disciples on one side and the Pharisees on the other end, it's important that we ask ourselves, when it comes to embracing this organizational change in my career role, which end of the spectrum am I closer to? And then what can I do to address that? Looking at your own mindset when it comes to things that have changed suddenly, remedially, transformational, structurally, on a personal basis, whether it's planned or not, whether you were involved in the choice or not, whether it just was thrust on you or not, how well do we, on a scale of 1 to 10, embrace the change? How long does it take us? How miserable are we in that negative energy state before we decide to, okay, you know what, I'm going to embrace it? How often have we said, just forget it, I'm leaving, I'm out? Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for 2 new videos each week. Tell me in the comments below about your career situation, and I'll make a video for you with a shout out. You can also become a member at Motivationeer.com. Your career is not just a way to make a living, it's a way to transform the world.